Story, a meteor mystery. New videos tonight show the moments a double boom.
You got this tractor trailer that's coming. Tractor trailer right here.
It is called a red heifer, and if you have never heard the term before this year, you are not alone. But in Jerusalem, among a growing number of rabbis, researchers, and ordinary citizens, it has become one of the most talked about subjects in the country, tied directly to a single obscure verse most Bible readers skip past entirely. This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord hath commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. Numbers, chapter 19, verse 2, part of one of the strangest and most detailed rituals described anywhere in the Torah. According to that chapter, ashes produced by burning a completely unblemished red heifer mixed with water were required to ritually purify anyone who had come into contact with death before that person could enter the temple or take part in its sacrifices. Without those ashes, the text is explicit. The purification cannot happen, and without purification, the priesthood cannot function inside a rebuilt temple, no matter how ready the building itself might be. For most of the last 2,000 years, that requirement sat quietly in the background of Jewish religious life, a law with no practical urgency, because there was no temple standing to require it. The last confirmed red heifer ceremony is traditionally dated to the years just before the Second Temple's destruction in the year 70. Since then, according to rabbinic tradition, the ashes have simply run out and the ritual has waited, described in detail in ancient texts but never performed, for a red heifer meeting the law's exact, almost impossibly strict requirements. This year, that 1800-year silence has been getting louder. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem, working alongside the National Institute for Red Cow Research, announced in June that a red heifer calf, later named Tamima, had been born on a dairy farm in the Galilee, the result of an unusual artificial insemination that produced a fully red calf from a breeding combination that typically yields black or dark-colored offspring. Researchers described the outcome as rare enough to draw immediate rabbinic attention. Then, in July, only about 6 weeks later, a second red heifer was born in the Golan Heights, with 2 additional heifers reportedly inseminated at the site of ancient Shiloh as part of a deliberate, long-term effort to establish a full herd of candidates rather than rely on a single animal. Unlike the 5 heifers imported from Texas in 2022, which sparked years of rabbinic debate over whether an animal born outside the land of Israel could ever meet the law's requirements, these new heifers were born inside Israel itself, removing what many religious authorities considered the single largest legal obstacle standing in the way of a valid ceremony. One recent report described the distinction plainly. The American-born heifers had been the subject of years of jurisprudential objection, specifically because of where they were born, while a heifer born in the Galilee sidesteps that entire debate. Ask yourself honestly what the odds were that after 18 centuries, without a single publicly confirmed candidate, multiple red heifers meeting increasingly serious rabbinic scrutiny would be born within weeks of each other, inside Israel itself, in the very same year that survey after survey shows public support for rebuilding the temple climbing to levels unseen in modern history. And if that wasn't enough, The animals themselves are only the most visible part of a much larger, much more organized movement that has been building quietly for years and is now impossible to ignore. According to reporting from Israel 365 News, roughly 150,000 men have enrolled in structured temples of training programs. Part of a stated goal of preparing 200,000 participants for roles that, for nearly 2,000 years, have had no temple to serve in. These are not vague expressions of religious sentiment. Organizers describe detailed instruction in the specific priestly duties, garments, and procedures described in Leviticus and Numbers. Training conducted with the same seriousness as any other professional certification, on the explicit premise that the men completing it may, within their own lifetimes, be called to perform these duties for real. Alongside the training numbers, a separate survey found that 55% of Israeli Jews now support rebuilding the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount, a level of public support that would have been almost unthinkable a generation ago, when the subject was treated as a fringe concern confined to a small number of religious nationalists. Temple Mount visitation by religious Jews has also climbed to record levels in recent years, a shift made possible by changing government policy and, according to several reports, quiet encouragement from officials sympathetic to the movement. None of this, on its own, requires a supernatural explanation. Religious revival movements rise and fall throughout history for entirely human reasons, tied to politics, generational change, national identity, and the aftermath of difficult wars that often push a population toward renewed religious seriousness rather than away from it. One report on the second red heifer's birth explicitly framed the moment in exactly those terms, suggesting the animal could symbolize a transition from a season of national pain and loss toward a season of renewal. That is a reasonable, entirely secular way to read a population turning toward its oldest religious traditions after years of conflict and uncertainty. But Scripture describes exactly this kind of convergence: priestly preparation, public religious fervor, and a specific ritual requirement suddenly becoming achievable after centuries of impossibility as more than incidental. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Thessalonica, described a figure who would one day sitteth in the temple of God, shewing himself that he is God. Language that has puzzled readers for nearly 2,000 years, precisely because it presumes a functioning temple, staffed by an active priesthood, standing in a city that has had neither since the year 70. For most of church history, that passage was read as either distant future or pure symbol because the practical preconditions it describes, a rebuilt temple, a trained priesthood, ritual purity restored through red heifer ashes, were simply unavailable. This year, for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, every one of those preconditions is being actively, deliberately, and publicly assembled, piece by piece, by people who state openly that this is exactly what they are trying to accomplish. And if that wasn't enough, the path to this point has not been smooth, and the honest version of this story has to include the part where it went wrong first. In the summer of 2025, organizers attempted what was widely reported and widely misreported as a red heifer ceremony carried out in Samaria. Byron Stinson, the Texas rancher who had originally brought 5 red heifers to Israel in 2022, later described the day in detail in an interview, explaining that the event had been intended from the start as a practice run, not a valid ceremony, and that the specific animal used had already been informally disqualified before the burning even took place. 2 of the original 5 imported heifers were ultimately ruled unsuitable by rabbinic authorities entirely, and the ashes produced that day, according to multiple sources close to the process, could not be used for genuine purification under Jewish law. The confusion that followed was significant enough that at least one prominent commentator covering the story publicly stated he would no longer produce content on the subject, explaining that he no longer trusted the information being provided to him about what had actually happened. That is worth including here, plainly and without spin, because it is exactly the kind of detail this genre of content too often leaves out in favor of a cleaner, more dramatic story. The 2025 event was not the fulfillment of Numbers 19. It was a rehearsal by the organizers' own account, and a confusing one, complicated by disqualified animals, disputed procedures, and public claims that outran what had actually taken place on the ground. That failure matters, and not just as a cautionary footnote. It is a reminder that the path from ancient text to modern fulfillment, if that is in fact what is unfolding, was never going to be a straight, clean line from prophecy to headline. It was always going to involve false starts, disqualified candidates, disputed rulings, and organizers working through the same kind of trial and error that accompanies any complex undertaking, sacred or otherwise. The 2 new red heifers born this year, in the Galilee and the Golan Heights, arrive specifically in the aftermath of that failed 2025 attempt, born into a movement that has already learned, publicly and somewhat painfully, how easy it is to move too fast and claim too much. That context should temper, not eliminate, the significance of what is happening now. A movement willing to publicly walk back its own overstated claims, rather than simply declaring victory and moving on, is behaving with a kind of institutional honesty that deserves to be taken more seriously, not less. The current heifers are, according to every available report, still under active rabbinic examination, still subject to disqualification if a single white or black hair appears as the animal matures, still years away from reaching the age of maturity Jewish law requires before any ceremony could even be considered. Nothing here is settled. Nothing here is imminent in the way a title card might suggest. But the direction of travel, from 0 credible candidates for 18 centuries to multiple actively monitored candidates born inside Israel within a single summer, is not in dispute. And if that wasn't enough, there is one detail about where this ceremony is supposed to take place that connects it directly to one of the most specific prophecies about the return of Christ found anywhere in Scripture. According to Numbers 19, the red Heifer ceremony cannot take place inside the temple itself, or even inside the city of Jerusalem. It must be carried out without the camp, a phrase Jewish tradition has long understood to mean a specific location outside the ancient walls. The Mount of Olives, directly east of the Temple Mount, positioned so that the officiating priest could look across the Kidron Valley and see the temple itself while the ceremony was performed. That detail, on its own, would be a minor point of ritual geography. But the Mount of Olives is not simply a convenient hillside. It is named specifically by location in one of the most direct prophecies in the entire Old Testament about the physical return of the Messiah. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 4, describing the exact ground where, according to the prophet, God himself will stand at the culmination of a final, climactic battle for Jerusalem. The New Testament closes the loop directly. When Jesus ascended from that same mountain, the angels who appeared to the watching disciples said plainly, "This same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven." Acts chapter 1 verse 11. An ascension that took place, according to the text, from the Mount of Olives itself. So the ceremony required to purify a future priesthood and the specific location where Scripture says the Messiah both departed and will one day return are, according to both the Torah and the prophets, the very same hillside. That is not a connection modern prophecy teachers invented for dramatic effect. It is embedded directly in the geography the ancient texts themselves specify long before anyone alive today was in a position to notice how neatly the pieces fit together. Rabbi Chaim Berkowitz and other researchers involved in the current Red Heifer effort have been explicit that any future ceremony would need to take place at a very specific site on the Mount of Olives, not simply anywhere in the general vicinity, a level of geographic precision that mirrors the specificity Scripture itself insists on throughout this entire subject. Whether or not a person accepts the prophetic reading, the plain historical and textual fact remains. The same hillside identified across multiple ancient sources as the site of a future purification ritual is also identified by name as the site of a future divine appearance. Two separate threads of Scripture, written centuries apart by different authors, converging on the same small stretch of ground outside Jerusalem's eastern wall. And if that wasn't enough, there is a second passage, this one describing what actually happens to the daily sacrifices. Once a functioning temple and a purified priesthood are finally back in place, and it is considerably more sobering than anything discussed so far. The prophet Daniel, writing centuries before the temple's actual destruction, described a coming figure who would confirm a covenant with many for a period of 7 years, and then, in the middle of that period, bring an abrupt end to sacrifice and offering. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, a passage Jesus himself referenced directly, telling his own disciples to watch for the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. That passage, like the others discussed throughout this message, presumes something that has been unavailable for nearly 2,000 years. An active, functioning system of daily sacrifice, requiring a rebuilt altar, a restored priesthood, and, according to Numbers 19, the ritual purification only a red heifer's ashes can provide. For most of church history, this passage was read as either purely symbolic or as describing a fulfillment so far in the future that the specific mechanics were not worth dwelling on in detail. It is only in this generation, watching red heifers born inside Israel, a trained priesthood numbering in the tens of thousands, and public support for a rebuilt temple climbing past 50%, that the literal mechanics Daniel described have moved. For the first time since the Roman legions tore the Second Temple down, from purely theoretical to potentially observable within a single human lifetime. It is important, in the interest of the same honesty, this message has tried to hold throughout to say plainly that serious faithful scholars disagree sharply about how literally to read Daniel's 70 weeks, about the identity of the figure described, and about the timeline connecting any of this to red heifers being raised on a hillside in the Galilee today. Some read the entire passage as already fulfilled in the 1st century, tied to events surrounding the Second Temple's actual destruction. Others read it as still future, tied directly to the very preparations being described in this message. That disagreement is genuine, long-standing, and unlikely to be resolved by any single video, this one included. What can be said without wading into that debate is simply this. Whichever reading is correct, the passage describes a system of sacrifice being established and then dramatically interrupted, and for that system to exist at all in the future sense, every one of the preconditions currently being assembled in Israel, trained priests, growing public support, and red heifers meeting increasingly serious rabbinic scrutiny, would first have to be in place. The pieces described as necessary for either the fulfillment or the reenactment of Daniel's prophecy are, for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, visibly, publicly, and deliberately being put together in real time. And if that wasn't enough, it is worth stepping back and asking the same question this entire message has circled from the beginning. Why now, and why all at once? Because the red heifers are not appearing in isolation. They are appearing in the same season as a river named, specifically in Revelation, reaching its lowest recorded level in nearly a century, in the same season as a total solar eclipse set to darken the skies over Europe for the first time in almost 30 years, in the same season as earthquake lights reported over a South American capital, in the same season as wars and rumors of wars stretching across more regions of the globe than most people alive today can remember at once. Any single one of these threads, taken alone, is the kind of story that surfaces every few years, gets discussed for a news cycle and fades. A river drought, an eclipse, a rare genetic outcome in a calf, a survey number ticking upward. None of them by itself would normally be treated as more than a curiosity. It is only when they are set beside each other, in the same handful of months, that the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence stacked on coincidence. Scripture describes exactly this kind of convergence as the defining feature of the season it calls the last days. Not a single dramatic event announced with unmistakable clarity, but a scattering of signs, arriving together in various places, each individually explainable and collectively difficult to ignore. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Matthew, chapter 24, verses 32 and 33, Jesus' own instruction for how to read a season exactly like this one. Not one leaf. All the leaves appearing together, each one insufficient on its own to prove the season has changed, and each one, taken together with the others, difficult to explain away as anything else. That is the honest claim underneath every message in this series, this one included. Not certainty, not a date. A pattern, assembled from independently verifiable, entirely secular facts, that happens to align, with striking specificity, with a 2,000-year-old text written by people with no conceivable way of knowing what a hydrologist, a geneticist, or a public opinion survey would eventually confirm. And if that wasn't enough, there remains the same question every message in this series eventually arrives at. What is a person actually supposed to do with a pattern like this one? Not panic. That has been the answer every single time this question has been asked across every message in this series, and it remains the answer here, for the same reasons Numbers 19 itself, the very chapter describing the red Heifer ritual, is not a chapter about fear. It is a chapter about purification, about restoring someone who has come into contact with death to a state where they can once again approach something holy. The entire purpose of the ashes, mixed with water, sprinkled on the third day and the seventh day according to the text, was never punishment. It was restoration, a path back into fellowship for someone who had been separated from it, often through no particular fault of their own, simply by proximity to loss and mortality, which it, for every human being, eventually regardless of how carefully they live. That framing matters enormously for how this entire subject should be received. A red heifer is not, in Scripture's own terms, primarily an object of dread. It is an instrument of mercy, existing specifically to make a way back to God for people who would otherwise remain separated from Him. If the ancient ritual is in fact being restored, piece by piece, in front of the watching world this year, the appropriate emotional response, according to the text's own internal logic, is not anxiety about an approaching deadline. It is the same quiet hope the original ritual was designed to provide, a way back, made available again to anyone who needs it. The Apostle Paul, writing centuries after Numbers but drawing directly on its imagery, made this connection explicit. For if the blood of bulls and of goats, and the ashes of an heifer sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Hebrews chapter 9, verses 13 and 14, written to a Jewish Christian audience who understood exactly what the red heifer ritual accomplished, and were being told that something greater, requiring no animal, no ashes, and no priesthood at all, had already been made available to them. That passage complicates the straightforward prophetic reading of this year's events in an important way, and the honest version of this message has to include that complication rather than smooth it over. If the red heifer ritual pointed forward to something already accomplished, once permanently, through Christ, then its literal physical restoration this year raises a genuine theological question that serious believers across different traditions answer differently. Is a literal, physical fulfillment of Numbers 19 still meant to happen, tied to a rebuilt temple and a restored priesthood, exactly as this message has described, or was the entire ritual system fulfilled once and for all in a way that makes any future literal repetition unnecessary? That is not a question this message is equipped to settle. It is a question worth taking directly to Scripture and to trusted teachers, rather than accepting a confident answer from any single video, including this one. Picture, for a moment, the actual scene on that dairy farm in the Galilee this past June, because the statistics and the theology alone do not carry the full weight of what witnesses describe. A calf is born the way calves are born on working farms across Israel every week, without any particular notice. But this one, from the moment the veterinarian and the attending rabbi arrive, is treated differently. Its coat is examined hair by hair, searching for even 2 black or white strands, which under Jewish law would be enough to disqualify the animal entirely, regardless of how red the rest of its body appears. Researchers describe running their hands slowly across the calf's back and flanks, checking for the presence of a yoke mark, a scar, any blemish at all, because the law's language, without spot wherein is no blemish, has historically been interpreted with a strictness that makes qualifying animals almost impossibly rare. The calf that was ultimately named Tamima had one complication early on. An ear tag, placed shortly after birth for identification purposes, was later removed after concerns that the tag itself might constitute a disqualifying blemish or the equivalent of a yoke. Rabbi Azariah Ariel, examining the healing ear afterward, reportedly described the animal as pure in her redness, noting that the tissue had healed sufficiently to preserve the calf's eligibility. That single detail, an argument over an ear tag capable of disqualifying an animal that had already cleared every other requirement, gives some sense of just how exacting this process actually is, and how far removed it is from the dramatic, decisive countdown language so much online coverage of this subject tends to use. This is not a story unfolding on a fixed timeline toward a guaranteed conclusion. It is a slow, careful, often frustrating process, involving veterinary examination, rabbinic disagreement, disqualified candidates, and years of waiting for an animal to simply mature without developing a single disqualifying hair. That reality does not make the underlying pattern less significant. If anything, it makes it more credible, because a movement willing to disqualify its own candidates over a single hair, rather than declaring premature victory the way the 2025 practice ceremony arguably did, is behaving with a level of rigor that suggests genuine conviction rather than manufactured spectacle. And if that wasn't enough, it is worth remembering, honestly, that red Heifer candidates have been announced and later disqualified before, more than once in the years leading up to this one. Of the 5 heifers originally imported from Texas in 2022, at least 2 have since been ruled unsuitable, disqualified over precisely the kind of minor physical detail that felled the ear tag concern with Tamima. Earlier candidates across the last decade have been announced with considerable fanfare, only to develop disqualifying hairs as they matured, or to be found, on closer rabbinic examination, not to meet the law's requirements after all. This is a pattern with a real history of false starts, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than glossed over in service of a cleaner narrative. That history should inform how this year's births are received. It would be dishonest to present 2 new heifers, born within 6 weeks of each other, as a guaranteed, imminent fulfillment of Numbers 19, when the historical track record shows candidates failing to reach maturity as qualifying animals more often than not. It would be equally dishonest to dismiss this year's developments as nothing more than another entry in a long line of disappointments, given how many of the surrounding preconditions, the priesthood training numbers, the public support survey, the Temple Mount visitation records, the specific detail of a heifer born inside Israel itself, rather than imported, have never converged this strongly before. The honest position, held carefully rather than performed dramatically, is this: the pattern is real, verifiable, and unprecedented in scope, compared to anything recorded since the Second Temple's destruction. The specific outcome, whether these particular animals mature into qualifying candidates, whether a valid ceremony is ever actually performed, whether any of this connects to the literal fulfillment of Daniel's 70 weeks or the abomination of desolation Jesus warned his disciples to watch for, remains genuinely uncertain, and anyone claiming otherwise with total confidence is offering more certainty than either the historical track record or Scripture's own repeated warnings about false certainty can support. Jesus' warning about deception sits, once again, in the very same discourse as his description of these signs. Take heed that no man deceive you. Matthew 24, verse 4, spoken in the same breath as wars, earthquakes, and famines. A reminder that watching for signs and refusing false certainty about their meaning were never meant to be in tension with each other. They were meant to operate together the entire time, in every generation that has ever taken this subject seriously. Scripture, once more, describes two different postures a person can take toward a pattern like this one. And the distinction is worth walking through slowly here, in the specific context of a small red calf on a hillside in the Galilee, rather than in the abstract. Some will hear about a red heifer. Note that it is an obscure detail from an ancient agricultural law, and move on without a second thought the way most people move past most news stories most days. That is not a failure of character or intelligence. It is simply the ordinary condition of a life full of ordinary demands, with no particular reason to treat a calf's coat color as personally significant. Scripture calls that condition sleep, without judgment, the same way it describes entire generations across history, who lived through their own share of wars, disasters, and unusual signs, without ever connecting them to anything beyond the ordinary difficulty of being alive in a hard world. Others, hearing the same story, will feel something shift. The same instinct that made witnesses in Caracas' film A Red Sky earlier this year, without fully understanding what they were looking at. The same instinct that has made every generation of watchers throughout history pay closer attention to unusual convergences than the surrounding culture typically does. That reaction is not manufactured by dramatic titles or urgent thumbnails, however much this genre of content leans on both to capture attention in the first place. It is older than algorithms, older than YouTube, older than the printing press. The same instinct Scripture calls watching. Jesus' instruction to that second group, across every version of this teaching scattered through the Gospels, has never wavered. What I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. Not a select group of rabbinic scholars capable of correctly interpreting the genetic requirements for a valid red heifer. Not a small circle of prophecy teachers with special access to interpretation. All. The invitation to watch this pattern, the red heifers, the trained priesthood, the survey numbers, the Mount of Olives, the abomination of desolation Daniel and Jesus both warned about, is open to whosoever is willing to actually pay attention, regardless of religious background, denominational affiliation, or how much Hebrew they can read. So here, before this closes, is the honest claim this message has actually been trying to make, stripped of the dramatic music and the countdown framing this genre usually reaches for. Two red heifers, meeting increasingly serious rabbinic scrutiny, were born inside Israel within 6 weeks of each other this year, following years of disqualified imported candidates and at least one publicly acknowledged failed practice ceremony. That fact is verifiable, documented by multiple independent religious and secular outlets, and not dependent on any particular prophetic interpretation to be true. Around that central fact, this message has laid out everything Scripture and current events actually support. The specific, almost impossibly strict requirements. Numbers 19 places, on a qualifying animal, the parallel, rapidly growing movement of priestly training and public support for a rebuilt temple. The specific geographic link between the red heifer ceremony and the Mount of Olives, the passages in Daniel and 2 Thessalonians that presume a functioning temple and priesthood, most of church history, treated as purely symbolic, and the honest theological complication raised by Hebrews 9, which describes the entire sacrificial system as already fulfilled once, permanently through Christ. None of that proves, with certainty, that this year's births are the specific animals Scripture has in mind, or that a valid ceremony will ever actually be performed on the timeline this movement's own organizers hope for. Scripture itself, through Jesus' own repeated warnings against false certainty, refuses to grant that kind of confidence to anyone in any generation, including this one. What the pattern does support, without requiring a leap beyond what the facts themselves demonstrate, is that the specific, narrow, ancient preconditions required for a literal fulfillment of Numbers 19. Preconditions that remained entirely theoretical for nearly 2,000 years are now being actively, publicly, and deliberately assembled, piece by piece, by people who state plainly that this is exactly what they intend to accomplish. Whether that assembly ultimately culminates in the events Daniel and Jesus both described, or simply represents the most serious and best documented attempt in nearly 2 millennia that nonetheless falls short the way earlier attempts have, the instruction sitting at the center of every single passage discussed in this message does not change. Watch, pray, keep your garments in the sense of living a life ready for sudden exposure. And remember, whatever the red heifers of Israel ultimately turn out to mean, that the mercy at the center of the entire ritual, a way back to God for peoples separated from Him by nothing more than the ordinary reality of living in a broken world, has never once required a person to correctly predict the timeline in order to receive it. There is one more layer to this story worth sitting with before this closes, and it has less to do with the animals themselves than with the sheer number of people across an entire country quietly reorganizing their lives around the possibility that this is real. 150,000 men training for a priesthood with no temple yet standing to serve in are not simply casual observers of a news story. Each one of those individuals has made a personal decision, often at real cost to their time, career, and daily life, to prepare seriously for a possibility most of their own grandparents would have considered pure fantasy. That kind of collective, sustained, costly commitment does not typically emerge from idle curiosity. It tends to emerge from genuine conviction, spread person to person, community to community, across a population that has decided, independently and in large numbers, that the ancient preconditions are worth preparing for in earnest, not simply discussing from a safe theoretical distance. The survey number, 55% of Israeli Jews supporting a rebuilt temple, deserves the same weight. Public opinion on a subject this specific, this historically loaded, and this politically complicated does not shift by that margin without something real driving it. Whatever combination of national trauma, religious revival, and generational change lies behind that number, the practical result is the same. A majority of a nation whose ancestors watched the Second Temple burn in the year 70 now say openly, in surveys conducted by professional pollsters, that they would support seeing it rebuilt, lapiered the animals on top of that human context, rather than treating them as the whole story. 2 calves born this year are not, by themselves, world-altering events. 2 calves born into a nation actively training a priesthood, actively debating temple reconstruction, actively visiting the Temple Mount in record numbers, and actively watching the same ancient texts that describe a red heifer ceremony describe, in the very same books, wars, earthquakes, a darkened sun, and a river running dry, events already unfolding in this same calendar year, according to the earlier messages in this series, are a different kind of story entirely. They are the missing piece a movement has been specifically, deliberately searching for, arriving in the exact season everything else this series has documented has also been arriving. That is not proof. It has never been proof in this message or any of the others in this series, and it was never going to be. But it is, at minimum, the kind of convergence that deserves more than a passing scroll past the headline. From anyone genuinely trying to understand what is unfolding in this particular corner of the world, in this particular year. One final thought, and then the lamps go out on this particular message for tonight. 2,000 years ago, a Jewish historian named Josephus watched the Second Temple burn, describing the destruction in detail so vivid that later readers have used his account to date the exact day the fires began. He could not have known that nearly 2 millennia later, researchers using artificial insemination, DNA testing, and rabbinic scholarship stretching back to the same era he lived in, would be racing to reverse the very condition his account describes. A temple destroyed, a priesthood scattered, and a purification ritual rendered impossible for lack of a single qualifying animal. He simply wrote down what he witnessed, the way the researchers, examining Tamima's healed ear this summer, wrote down what they witnessed, trusting that the details would matter to someone, someday, even if they could not have predicted exactly how. That someone this year might be you, watching a story about a calf born on a dairy farm in the Galilee and feeling something shift that has nothing to do with algorithms or engagement metrics and everything to do with the same old instinct that has made watchers across every generation since Josephus pay closer attention than everyone around them to the small, easily dismissed details that later turned out to matter. If any part of tonight's message reached something in you, do not let it pass by unused. Bring it somewhere real. Say a prayer, out loud if you can, even if the only one listening at first is God himself, asking him to give wisdom to the researchers and rabbis navigating an almost impossibly precise ancient law, to give patience to the 150,000 men training for a role that may or may not be needed in their own lifetime, and to open your own eyes to whatever this pattern is actually meant to show you. Leave that prayer in the comments below, not as a performance for strangers scrolling past, but as a genuine request, spoken honestly in whatever words come to you tonight. If this message helped you see the red heifers of Israel and everything Scripture has said about what they represent, more clearly than you did an hour ago, consider staying close to this channel in the days ahead. These animals are still years from maturity, and the movement surrounding them is not slowing down. Like this video if any part of it spoke to you tonight. Share it with someone who needs to hear that an obscure verse from Numbers, a calf born in the Galilee, and a nation quietly preparing a priesthood it has not needed in 2,000 years are all, this year, converging in the same place at the same time. And subscribe so that when the next sign appears, in this land, in another one, or in a corner of Scripture, nobody thought to watch closely enough. You will already be here, watching, rather than finding out secondhand after the moment has already passed. Because the ashes that once purified a nation and the God who first commanded them to be gathered have never once stopped preparing a way back for whosoever is willing to take it. Watch, pray, and whatever the red heifers of Israel ultimately turn out to mean, remember that the mercy at the center of this entire story was never contingent on getting the timeline right. It was never contingent on correctly predicting which calf would qualify, which year the training would finish, or which reading of Daniel and Hebrews turns out to be the right one. It was only ever contingent on whosoever calling, honestly, on the name of the Lord, tonight, in whatever words come, From wherever you are watching this, whether that is a quiet room in Jerusalem, a farmhouse in the Galilee, or a couch on the other side of the world, watching a small red calf change everything you thought you knew about how close or how far the ancient promises might actually be. It is worth pausing on one more thread before the closing prayer, because it ties this story to a pattern much larger than Israel alone, and it may be the detail most easily missed by anyone only skimming the headlines. This is not the first time in Jewish history that red Heifer candidates have been searched for with this level of national attention. Jewish tradition holds that only 9 red heifers were ever successfully used across the entire span from Moses to the Second Temple's destruction, a number small enough that entire centuries sometimes passed without a single qualifying animal being found. The 10th, according to that same tradition, is reserved specifically for the Messianic era, a detail Maimonides himself recorded in his legal writings roughly 800 years ago, long before genetic testing or artificial insemination made the search for a qualifying heifer a matter of laboratory precision rather than pure chance. If the current effort succeeds, whichever specific animal eventually qualifies would, by that centuries-old count, be the 10th and the first in nearly 2,000 years. That detail is not something modern prophecy commentary invented to heighten the drama. It sits directly in classical rabbinic sources, cited by scholars with no connection to Christian end-times theology whatsoever, who have their own long-standing tradition of watching for exactly this animal as a marker of a specific and highly anticipated era. 2 entirely separate religious traditions, reading 2 related but distinct sets of texts, have independently arrived at the conclusion that a successfully qualified red heifer would mark something significant, arriving not from a single YouTube channel's interpretation, but from centuries of independent scholarship converging on the same small red animal. Whatever your own tradition or background, that convergence, ancient rabbinic expectation and New Testament prophecy, both treating this name-obscure ritual as a marker of the last days, arriving in the same summer that 2 heifers meeting serious scrutiny were born inside Israel itself, is worth sitting with honestly one final time before this message closes.